Good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to greet you all, and especially those who are joining us virtually this evening. As you know, you can always submit your questions for tonight's speaker through the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen, and we will try and answer many of them. My name is Melanie Tanyelian. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the Center for Armenian Studies. And this evening, I'm thrilled to welcome Professor Daniel Fairfax, who has traveled to Ann Arbor from Germany to be with us here in person. And in the context of the pandemic, international visitors have been few and far between, which makes this even more exciting. For the last 4 years, Professor Fairfax is an assistant professor of film studies at the Goethe Universität in Frankfurt, Germany. He has earned his PhD from Yale University in film studies, as well as comparative literature in 2017. His research focuses on French film theory in the post-1968 period, and has been widely published in important journals in his field, among them the Studies in European Cinema, Cinema Journal, and Studies in French Cinema. He has translated and edited a number of film theoretical works, such as Cinema Against Spectacles, Technique and Ideology of Jean-Luc Comolli, Conversations with Christian Metz, 100 Years of Soviet Cinema, which was published in 2019, and The Structures of the Film Experience, also published in 2019. His recent publication is an impressive 2-volume study titled The Red Years of Cahiers du Cinéma from 1968 to 1973, which came out just last year in 2021 with Amsterdam University Press. The monograph examines the militant turn of Cahiers du Cinéma under the journal's editors Jean-Louis Comolli and Jean Nabary after May 1968 in France, after the uprisings of May 68 in France. The red years of the journal, inspired, as Dr. Fairfax shows, by Marxist and psychoanalytical theory, that would be seminal for film studies then and continue to be influential in the field today. The first volume focuses on ideology and politics and counters arguments that presented the years of 68 to 73 as non-legendary. Instead, Fairfax exposes the Marxist leaning of the editors, emblematic in their 1969 manifesto, Cinema, Ideology and Critique, and their introductions of Louis Althusser's theory of ideology, which together not only moved a politically neutral journal towards the radical left, but also produced a new set of film theoretical discussions that would have a long-lasting legacy. The second volume dives really into matters of aesthetics and the journal editor's project of discerning the ontological nature of cinema. But how do we move from France to Armenia? And perhaps more precisely, Soviet Armenia, as we just now saw in this fantastic film called Seasons from 1975 that was produced by Artavazd, Peleshian. This evening, Professor Fairfax will speak about the work of the filmmaker Artavazd Peleshyan, a simultaneously elusive figure and a point of obsession in the film world. As the editor of the Australian online film journal Census of Cinema from 2014 until just recently last month, Dr. Fairfax has written about Peleshyan's work as well as his positionality as an Armenian filmmaker born in Gyumri who, living in Moscow in the late 60s and 70s, developed, in Fairfax's words, a remarkable synthesis of artistic practice and theoretical exploration, which some might even see as inverted. Peleshian, whose film and theoretical writings are known for their unique sense and understanding of montage, expresses how for him theory and practice comes together when he says, I quote, "My theoretical work in no ways helps me with my concrete artistic practice. I have determined that I do something first and only afterwards look at an explanation. It is therefore not really the case that I follow a pre-formulated montage method," Peleshian writes, "and make a film out of it. On the contrary, I first make a film. What people call my theory is actually nothing but my search for meaning of what I do, for an explanation of the structure of the whole," end of quote. And the search of meaning and for an explanation of the whole seems ever more urgent in this moment of ambiguity, precarity, and also improbability. And we may perhaps find instruction in the filmic work of a man who rather sits in silence and refuses to answer question, who rebukes rather than embraces. And I am very intrigued to learn more about Mr. Peleshian through Dr. Daniel Fairfax.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank Melanie and the Center for Armenian Studies for inviting me here to talk about Artavazd Peleshian, and Naira also for helping with the organization so helpfully, and also for kind of taking the plunge to bring me actually physically here to Ann Arbor to kind of return to the practice of in-person events, obviously now hybrid events, seeing as we're doing it both in person and on Zoom. And you know, I hope this will be the first in a series of in-person events hosted by the Center for Armenian Studies, and that we kind of get back into the swing of doing things the traditional way, because Zoom has some advantages, absolutely, but in some ways you're missing out on the kind of the essential experience of academic exchange. So that's just a couple of prefatory remarks. Thank you also for that wonderful introduction, which I do not deserve in the slightest. But I'll move right now into my talk, Contrapuntal Montage in the films of Artavazd Peleshian. Melanie, I think, prefaced this very well, but I do want to kind of give a bit of a background information on Artavazd Peleshian and on his films before kind of diving into some of the deeper questions. Just a word of note, there are many different ways to kind of render his name into the Roman alphabet, and I've adopted for this Peleshian. There are different ways that people do it, Y, whatever. And often the French spelling will appear very frequently with a C instead of an S, so there's some, let's say, inconsistency there. This is Artavazd Peleshian on screen. He was born, I think as Melanie also noted, in the city of Gyumri, at the time known as Leninarkhan, in 1938, February 22nd, 1938. And initially actually worked in the nearby city of Kirovakan as a mechanical engineer before he actually moved to Moscow in 1963 at the age of around 24 to enroll at VGIK, the National Film School of the USSR. Now VGIK is a very important institution in Soviet film culture. It is in fact the oldest film school in the world. So the Soviet film industry, or the really pioneered the idea of film schools well before any other countries had even thought of doing so. And it's essentially the school where, I mean, virtually every prominent Soviet and indeed post-Soviet filmmaker studied and also taught. So there was a real transmission of cultural knowledge and of technical knowledge at VGIK. Figures like, I mean, famously, figures like Sergei Zheremisov taught there and then studied there and then kind of studied there and then taught there, and then, you know, then also became kind of rectors there and so on and so forth. Peleshian himself studied in the documentary department under Leonid Kristel, a kind of prominent documentary filmmaker himself. His first couple of films that now kind of make up the oeuvre of Artavazd Peleshian were actually made while a film student at VGIC as kind of student films essentially, although they then kind of gained a public airing before he moved on to kind of make films independently. He has ended up completing 10 films that are generally recognized as certain rumored films of his that kind of have been spoken about but not seen. These films are mostly shorts, ranging from, I think the shortest one comes in at about 6 minutes. The longest one is his most recent one at around 60 minutes. But generally they tend to be shorter films within the kind of 10 to 30 minute range. So if you take his entire kind of oeuvre together, it could probably fit on like a double DVD box set. That said, I think his oeuvre is one of the most kind of fundamental corpuses of films in the kind of last 50 years of cinema. And I think they've had a wide-ranging influence that go beyond their kind of magnitude and indeed beyond the kind of marginalized status that Peleshian had in the Soviet and then later post-Soviet film industry, which we'll get into. His works are pretty uniformly films of poetic abstraction, which are almost entirely free of kind of the traditional elements of mainstream narrative cinema that we recognize, things like acting, even human language is largely free, or is largely absent from his films. We saw in the seasons a couple of title cards, but they are virtually the only title cards you even actually see in Peleshian films, and you almost get no dialogue, no kind of spoken language in that sense. At the very limit, you sometimes hear snippets of words, but usually they're inaudible. And indeed, they're pretty much absent of traditional narrative structures that we would recognize both in fiction and documentary cinema. I think, again, the seasons are a useful or a very telling example of that. Throughout his life as a filmmaker, he worked between Moscow and Yerevan. His work has focused on both Armenian and more broadly Soviet history, but has also taken on ecological and even possibly we could say cosmic themes. It's the same generation as some other Caucasian filmmakers such as Sergei Parajanov and Mikhail Vartanov, who he also had kind of dealings with as he emerged as a filmmaker. And I think what marks Peleshian out, though, as a filmmaker of his generation is his particular attunement to questions of montage. In this sense, he was working in a kind of Soviet tradition, but as I'll kind of get into later, one that had, within the Soviet Union itself, kind of been, almost forgotten about. So montage is the kind of idea that films can create meaning and aesthetic effect through editing, not just through what's in any individual image itself. And once again, I'll get into this matter a little bit more later. As I think Melanie noted, he's also, I think, very interesting because he was engaged in the theorization of his own filmmaking, of his own cinema, doing so in interviews, but also in kind of theoretical texts, articles that he published. And in this sense, there's a kind of dialectics of theory and practice, let's say, in his work that I find very interesting. I mean, he says, oh, I kind of worked instinctually and then theorized it later, but I think the kind of thought processes at least much more kind of complex than maybe that kind of a quote would suggest. So his early films that he made for the gig include Mountain Patrol from 1964 and Land of the People from 1966, both essentially one-reelers, so around 9 to 10 minutes each. They already evince some of the hallmarks of Peleshian's kind of later, more mature work. They're abstract documentaries accompanied by music rather than voiceover. There is a distinct, centrality of editing in the kind of structure of the films. And they have a kind of circular movement created through the repetition of key images, let's say, that kind of recur from one moment in the film to the next. But Artavazd Peleshian himself does not consider them kind of, as belonging to his kind of mature oeuvre. So he still almost kind of thinks of them as kind of juvenilia. And indeed, his approach to montage would evolve and develop and go into different directions after these two films. His first mature film then would be The Beginning from 1967, also a short film, 9 minutes, but as a viewing experience, when watching this film in particular, I think that 9 minutes can feel like 30, 40, 50 minutes. And I say this in a good way, not in the sense that it's kind of boring. The film was commissioned on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, obviously that took place in 1917. And it kind of, within the space of 9 minutes, tells almost the entire political history of the USSR and indeed the world at large at this kind of absolutely breakneck pace. There's a mixture of archival material and some footage shot by Peleshian himself, but the film is really kind of edited like at an incredibly rapid pace in a manner that does actually recall the kind of Soviet silent cinema of the 1920s, which was also renowned for its kind of fast-paced editing. And the sensation of speed is also accentuated by the soundtrack for the film, which largely incorporates the composition Time Forward by Georgy Sviridov, which was originally made for the film of the same name, Time Forward, and has since actually become well known to Russian audiences as the theme tune for Vremya, the news, like the nightly news has this theme, which kind of gives the Peleshian's film now a kind of almost different resonance, possibly for contemporary Russian audiences. There's also, however, a modulation of rhythm in the film. So there's this kind of incredibly fast-paced moments, but also moments where the pace of the film like slows down or even comes to a still stand. There's a kind of almost moments of freezing of time that are kind of particularly pregnant historical moments in this kind of time period that Peleshian's film depicts, most notably the death of Lenin, and then World War II, the kind of destruction of large swaths of Soviet territory at that moment. This film, we'll see a short clip of it in a second, but I would also argue it's a kind of the film in Peleshian's oeuvre that kind of cleaves most closely to a kind of official Soviet historiography. So it's kind of, there is a sense in the film that this kind of popular struggle or class struggle is leading to a kind of forward motion in history that kind of like, hopefully will kind of progress society. And this idea is kind of much more attenuated in his following films. But I did want to show about a 3-minute clip of the beginning to get a sense for this film and for its kind of achievement. In this clip, kind of from the start of the film, we'll essentially see all of Russian history from 1917 to 1924 condensed into 3 minutes, or 3 of the most exhilarating minutes, I would claim, that you'll experience in cinema. So hopefully this works. I will try the clip now. Just have to move it forward a little bit. All right. there. So there's a lot to take in just those 3 minutes. So he followed up the beginning with We in 1969, a somewhat longer film, initially conceived actually as a feature film, but ending up coming in at 23 minutes, which was very much more focused on kind of Armenian history, Armenian culture, and indeed was this kind of reflection on the genocide of the Armenians in 1915 and the traumatic resonances it has had for the contemporary population of the Republic. There was, of course, this kind of moment of national reawakening after these mass demonstrations in Yerevan in 1965. That kind of led to the official acknowledgement of the genocide by the Soviet government, the genocide committed by the Ottomans, so it's relatively easy for them to kind of acknowledge that. And I think it was also essentially the first film that truly embodied Peleshian's theory of montage, or contrapuntal montage, that we'll get into later in this lecture. There is also, though, the continued presence of, let's say, more traditional linear forms of montage, such as the alternation of contemporary repatriations of Armenians, from other countries, with stock footage that is reputedly of the genocide. I have skepticism about where exactly that archival footage comes from, but certainly that's the effect that Peleshian is trying to create. So I'll we'll get into a clip in a second, but also mention there's this use of symbolism in the film as national allegory. So kind of shots of Mount Ararat, shots of this kind of young girl who almost stands in for the nation. At the same time, there is a steadfast refusal of Peleshian to kind of succumb to, let's say, ethno-nationalism. He always kind of rejects this idea that this is somehow purely Armenian film, but actually kind of claims it has much more universal resonance. And indeed, this is probably the film of his that had the most difficulties with censorship, as kind of constantly subject to changes and alterations, and kind of met with a long back and forth process between Peleshian and the kind of film authorities, let's say, before kind of reaching the public. So I wanted to show a brief clip from this film too, where precisely we see this kind of cutting back and forward from this archival footage, supposedly from the 1915 genocide, and this kind of contemporary footage where we see Armenians who had kind of been exiled for 50 years since then, returning to their homeland. So again, I'll just bring this up, and I'll have to zoom way forward on this one. That's in his following two films, The Inhabitants from 1970, also a shorter film, 10 minutes, and indeed the film we saw this evening, The Seasons from 1975, we really see an ecological turn in Peleshian's work. It's the reason partly why it belongs in this series, where the focus shifts from, in the last two of his films, the history of revolution, war, and genocide in Armenia or the Soviet Union more generally, to man's relationship with the natural environment, let's say. In the Inhabitants, we see a montage of animals essentially fleeing in terror from the sound of gunshots, kind of very pointedly, let's say, environmentalist intervention, and in a kind of critique of a kind of exploitative relationship with the animal world by humanity. And we see the counterpart to that in The Seasons, where precisely we have this kind of vision of a harmonious relation between, in this case, Armenian shepherds, their flock, and their mountainous surrounds. And indeed, the film, for most of its duration, is accompanied by Vivaldi's Four Seasons, possibly an obvious choice, but I think a very effective one. The film has these moments of pure joy, which hopefully we all experience, seeing these farmers kind of sliding down hillsides with their sheep or with these kind of haystacks. And the editing structure to the film is actually very similar to that of We, and I'll maybe get into that soon. Since we already watched the film, I don't need to show a clip. His following film was Our Century from 1982, up until very recently his longest film, coming in at 50 minutes. The thematic focus here moves to space exploration, which is seemingly actually a preoccupation of Peleshian's for a long time, and indeed these kind of cosmological ideas also imbue his theoretical thinking about cinema. The film, particularly its kind of middle segment, contains a gentle mocking of humanity's pretensions at mechanical flight, of the idea that we can kind of leave the earth, leave the ground, and kind of ascend into the heavens. What's interesting too, in the political context of the early 1980s, a moment also when the Cold War was starting to heat up again, is there is a very deliberate blurring of the distinction between the USA and the USSR in the space race, let's say. It rejects the idea of this kind of race or contest between the superpowers, and indeed, he very fluidly edits between the Soviet space program and its American counterpart. The project was of a decidedly bigger scope and significantly bigger budget than Peleshian's previous films. And indeed, he had this kind of remarkable access to the Soviet space program, which allowed him to film on site in its kind of, rocket launch sites. I can't imagine an American experimental filmmaker being given the same kind of access to like NASA's space program. I mean, it's almost inconceivable in this country that kind of thing would happen if like Ken Jacobs or someone was going to make a film about NASA. The montage in the film, however, I feel is a little bit less, let's say, tautly structured than his earlier films. Partly maybe the duration of the film, and certain maybe challenges he found with dealing with this subject matter, but there are these kind of undeniable moments of sublimity in his utilization, let's say, of space imagery. So again, just going to show a brief clip to give you a taste of this. I apologize in advance for the quality of the images in this film, because I think this is probably the one film that it really suffers from that. I have once experienced watching this film on 35 millimeter, and it's kind of, and just seeing it under those conditions is quite the experience. But we'll get a kind of shadow of that here with this clip. So, I'll kind of zoom forward. It's a bit too far. you might have noticed Jean-Michel Jarre on the soundtrack. Generally not a fan of his, but I think it works in this context. So his later films, there were two notable later works that Peleshian signed off on: The End from 1992, 8 minutes, and Life from 1993, a year later, 6 minutes. Over the course of this kind of 25, 30 years, he ended up making about 9 films. These are both, I would argue, kind of minor works, still kind of working on the level of abstraction, but largely bereft of the experimentation with montage seen in the earlier films. And at moments, they almost border on kitsch, in certain manners. The End depicts a train ride through a tunnel that's kind of approaching this light at the end of the tunnel, and we see the kind of various passengers in the train, and in some sense, as the title would indicate, is and it's made right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a kind of post-Soviet pendant to the beginning. And Life, by contrast, possibly it's kind of after the end of the moment of rebirth, shows footage of a woman giving birth, which is pulsed by the child's heartbeat on the soundtrack. I think a very personal film for Peleshian. I have a sense that the child being born was a relative of his of some kind. I'm not sure exactly which, a daughter or granddaughter or niece or something. The diptych was long considered to be the final chapter in Peleshian's cinematic oeuvre, despite his attempts at more grandiose projects. And indeed, he kind of wrote scripts for kind of large-scale films, notably 2 scripts titled Mirage and Homo Sapiens, were included in the book Moy Kino, which was published in Russian in 1988, but they would never realize, they never managed to find the money to actually produce them. So that's his kind of oeuvre, at least up until very recently, which I'll kind of end with. But right now I wanted to get in kind of a bit more deeply into his kind of ideas about montage, and in particular the theory of contrapuntal montage, or montage at a distance, that he developed and then kind of, let's say in his telling, put into practice first and then kind of theoretically developed. So Peleshian works in the tradition of montage cinema, which in a Soviet context at least is associated above all with figures from the silent era from the 1920s, in particular Sergei Eisenstein and Dziga Vertov. Though not only those, I mean, there's other figures like Vsevolod Pudovkin, Lev Kuleshov, Alexander Dovzhenko, and others who are kind of part of this movement. Their more radical experiments with montage, though, were quashed in the 1930s, thanks largely to the dual effects of sound cinema, which kind of limited what filmmakers could actually achieve on the level of kind of the montage of images. And then also, of course, Stalinism, and these kind of works were denounced as formalist and replaced with this socialist realist aesthetic, which was, we'd all agree, anything but realist in that sense. By the time we get to the post-World War II era, and then the kind of Thor under Khrushchev and so on and so forth, the kind of revitalization of Soviet film art, montage was a largely forgotten legacy actually in Soviet cinema. So there was a much more prevalent tendency towards a kind of long take aesthetic, as could be seen in the works of figures as diverse as Mikhail Kalatozov or Andrei Tarkovsky, and indeed many others. So this montage approach to cinema that was so dominant and so prevalent in the 1920s, that was really the signature of Soviet cinema in the 1920s. By the time you get into the 1960s, it's barely being practiced by Soviet filmmakers themselves, even though it was kind of still influential for international cinema. Peleshian, therefore, acts as a kind of missing link in film history, connecting the legacy of Eisenstein and Vertov with more modern uses of the technique of montage. And indeed, he also followed Eisenstein and Vertov by theorizing his own filmmaking. This is something they did as well. Eisenstein in particular wrote copious amounts of kind of theoretical text to kind of develop his ideas. Vertov was also very kind of prolific with the written word, trying to kind of not just instinctively make cinema, but actually subject it to this kind of theoretical interrogation. This is also something of a lost practice. It's very rare now for filmmakers to kind of write this kind of theoretical text that, say, someone like Sergei Eisenstein did. In Peleshian's case, his major theoretical text was Montage at a Distance, or A Theory of Distance, which was first published in 1972 in Russian, but its first decent English translation had to wait until 2015. It appeared in French in, I think, 1989, and then there was this bad English translation, I think in the early 2000s, that was actually translated from a German translation, if I got it right, and a lot gets lost in that translation. But finally, in 2015, we get a reputable English version of the text. In this text, Peleshian does admit the influence of Eisenstein and Vertov, in particular on his work, but he also seeks to distance himself from them and to demarcate his practice from their own. So there's a very complex relationship between those earlier figures and Peleshian's own work, even though I think the influences can be seen in many ways in his films. It's perhaps better seen as a kind of dialectical development of montage practice, building on the work of pioneers, but not limiting oneself to kind of implementing their ideas in a kind of schematic manner, rather like kind of forging new terrain, let's say, in this practice. So very quickly to kind of whether not everyone in the audience would necessarily be film experts, ask the question, what is montage? I would distinguish montage. I mean, it's often used as a synonym for editing, but I would argue it should be distinguished from editing as a kind of technical practice that almost any film has to do. You have to kind of put images together. It's rather an aesthetics based on the combination of filmic elements, whether those are images or those are sounds or images with sounds. And indeed, the real kind of Copernican revolution, you could say, where montage starts to be kind of theorized and developed on this deeper level, does come in the work and writings of Sergei Eisenstein, who argued that the combination of filmic elements could produce an effect that is not contained in any single one of those elements, in any single one of those images, or any single one of those sounds. It's what Eisenstein called the third image. You add image 1 to image 2, and you get this image 3 that doesn't exist on the screen, but rather emerges kind of from the interaction between the two images. So he writes here, piece A, so image 1, let's say, derived from the elements of the theme being developed, and piece B, derived from the same source, in juxtaposition, give birth to the image in which the thematic matter is most clearly embodied. This is kind of Eisenstein's argument for conceiving of montage as this kind of very specifically cinematic thing that couldn't be achieved through other means. He also conceived of montage as this kind of cellular or organic phenomenon. So it wasn't just a case of kind of putting one brick on another brick on another brick and so on and so forth. But rather, when you add two images together, they kind of have this organic force to them. They kind of can grow and multiply and so on and so forth. And it was therefore also dialectical in nature. Eisenstein obviously trying to justify his own practice through kind of, let's say, recourse to Marxist theory, in this case, arguing that montage is kind of a dialectical use of images. But there were also limitations to what, to his ideas about montage, which kind of really come down to the limitations of cinematic language and the fact that film communicates in a very different way to verbal language. It can't be kind of reduced to this idea of you can create kind of direct equivalences to linguistic structures through filmmaking. And this kind of, Eisenstein had many grand plans. At one point, he wanted to adapt Das Kapital to the screen, to make a film version of Das Kapital, but he couldn't realize it. He couldn't get there because, in a way, images work in a very different manner than the written work that Karl Marx used for Capital. So just to, give an example here of this idea that kind of montage can create a third image that doesn't exist in any of the images themselves. This is the kind of two image sequence, not from Eisenstein, but actually from Ziga Vertov's A Sixth of the World, where this is almost the archetypal example of Soviet montage. We have here an image of African workers in the fields toiling, kind of producing the wealth of society, and then here the rich Western bourgeois who is kind of wearing fancy fur coats and going out for a night on the town and kind of enjoying the fruits of that labor. And it is for Vertov, the idea of capitalist exploitation, as with Eisenstein, exists not in any one of these images, but actually in their combination, in the fact that you can cut from this one to this one. So that's kind of, in a way, montage was perfect for the Soviet filmmakers for what they were trying to achieve, both aesthetically, but also kind of ideologically, let's say, politically. So we then come to the question of montage in Peleshian. He argued, and I think there's some justification here, obviously, that classical, what he termed classical montage, so Eisensteinian, Goethean montage, 1920s Soviet montage, involves direct juxtapositions. Involves, as we saw in that Vodov example, you cut directly from one image to another image to create this montage effect. In Peleshian's own work, he argued that he sought to create montage effects between images that were not just directly juxtaposed to one another, but that were also within the film remote from one another, that could be detached from each other, be very distant from one another, kind of occur at very distinct parts of the film, but still have these montage relations as if they were kind of directly juxtaposed. This is his idea of montage at a distance. Question then emerges, well, how do you achieve that? How are you supposed to, as a spectator, know which images are being kind of montaged with which other images? There are certain strategies Peleshian kind of devises to achieve this. One in particular is this kind of process of repetition and variation, almost equivalent to kind of like, say, musical, like contrapuntal music or the kind of counterpoints in music. And in this sense, the aura, let's say, of missing images can be felt by the viewer. And these missing images can then enter into montage relations with the on-screen images. So earlier images in the film can kind of be evoked by the filmmaker in the minds of the viewer. And therefore, then we are kind of like mentally editing them together with the images we see. This, in his view, produces a kind of much more circular or spiralic structure to his films. Peleshian refers to their orbital or nuclear quality, he often used this kind of, let's say, astrophysical terminology to talk about his cinema. And then furthermore, montage can be created not merely between individual shots, but also between entire sequences or blocks of images, which then, there's kind of like almost he's conceiving of like extra dimensions of montage. This becomes clear in the text, his 1972 text, where he has this diagram, although this is actually not the correct version of the diagram as he kind of lamented. But this is from his text. He writes that the montage connections examined from the point of view of collision or interval between adjacent shots can be designated in this way. We have, A and B interacting with each other. This is classical montage, Eisensteinian, Goethean montage. Then from the point of view of montage at a distance, Peleshian's own montage, the relations between the shots or blocks look very different. Now we have this added diagram, A and B interacting with each other in one block, then interacting, that whole block is interacting with this other block, which is also in the actual graph, it should be B and A. It should be this kind of reversal of the original instance. But there's this idea of this kind of like new dimensions of montage, new layers, new kind of possibilities for the practice. So how can we kind of like conceive of this in a kind of like concrete manner within his films? The image, the example he gives in his text is an image of a young girl who has this kind of allegorical or symbolic force for Armenia, let's say, which is accompanied by a musical refrain used to punctuate 3 segments of the film. This is not this image itself, but certainly the musical refrain appears at the beginning, it appears in the middle, and then finally at the end. This is the image of the girl that we see. And in the first 2 instances, we see the girl. But in the third instance, the music is repeated, almost as a spectator, because this association between that particular moment of music and this image of the girl, we have that association almost like ready to plug in, but we don't get the girl. We instead get this scene of it's kind of like people massed on the balconies of an apartment building. And in that sense, it's actually the, let's say the use of the music that kind of coaxes the viewer to create a montage effect between this image and then this image, even though those 2 images are never really, they never enter into a direct juxtaposition with each other. Instead, this kind of the girl kind of becomes this visual counterpoint to the second image, to the image of the kind of Armenian people on the balconies, and is therefore able to enter into a montage relationship with it. I think similar moments can be seen in the seasons. I'd like to maybe hear what people thought themselves, but certainly this moment where we see the farmers dragging down the haystacks down the kind of mountain slope. In the middle of the film, we again get the same, at the end of the film, the same kind of movement. This time they're sliding down hill slopes with kind of sheep in their arms. But the similarity in this kind of vertical movement evokes those earlier images as well, and you kind of mentally conjure up the earlier scenes in the film. And I think this is the kind of effect Peleshian was looking for in his films. So just maybe in kind of, as I kind of wrap things up a little bit here, just wanted to go a little bit into the history of his reception and influence, and this kind of answers Melanie's question at the start, like how do you get from France to Armenia, or like in reverse, how do you get from Armenia to France? So despite a screening of We at the Oberhausen Short Film Festival in 1972, which was his first and for a long time only kind of international exposure, Peleshian was practically unknown in the West. I was like almost, I don't even have to say practically, he was unknown in the West. And of course, he was also significantly marginalized in the USSR and become this kind of fated figure, kind of canonized in film history in a way maybe some other Soviet filmmakers were able to become. Despite, let's say, differences with the Soviet government's own kind of concepts of cinema, thinking of Parajanov and Tarkovsky and so on and so forth. This changed, however, almost like overnight in 1982 with the discovery of Artavazd Peleshian by the film critic Serge Denay, who had actually just left Cahiers du Cinema at that point and joined the newspaper Libération, but he definitely came from that Cahiers du Cinema critical tradition. I, of course, put discovery here in quotation marks because it's a bit like saying Columbus discovered the Americas. It's not like, plenty of Soviets, Russians, and Armenians knew about Artavazd Peleshian, possibly not the wider public, but certainly people in the film world. So Serge Denay was this kind of, the colonialist figure coming in and discovering this unknown filmmaker. He wrote this absolutely adulatory article about Peleshian, having watched his films and met Peleshian in person. And this led to an explosion of interest in the filmmaker, first in France and then internationally. And eventually, we have kind of large number of articles written on him. Still no like book-length studies, although hopefully that will come soon. Retrospectives, art shows, and so on and so forth, all dedicated to Peleshian. He's also notable for his influence on two very, very well-known French filmmakers, Jean-Luc Godard and Chris Marker, who are both very much interested in his work, and I think it distinctly transformed their own approaches to montage. We also see homages to Peleshian in both Godard and Mark. I think Godard in particular had several kind of dialogues with Peleshian, and I think Godard's later work from the kind of late 1980s onwards really kind of displays or shows a distinct debt to Peleshian and to the impact that Peleshian's films had on him. I think he also had an impact on a number of younger filmmakers. Andrei Udica, not so young now, but certainly at the time was definitely influenced by Peleshian, Sergei Loznitsa, and an Italian, who's a Russian kind of filmmaker also working with found footage. And the Italian filmmaker Pietro Marcello actually made a documentary on Peleshian in 2011, Il Silenzio di Peleshyan, which the title comes from the fact that he actually found a lot of really fascinating footage kind of to do with Peleshian's films, but contacted Peleshian, said, I want to make a documentary about you. Are you okay with this? Do you want to participate? And Peleshian said, yeah, I'll be in it. That's fine. On the one condition that I don't speak. So we see a lot of Peleshian, but he never opens his mouth. He just kind of wanders around the streets of Yerevan in this kind of perpetual stony silence. It's nonetheless, I think, a really fascinating film and gives a lot of insight into his filmmaking method. It's notable that a lot of the recent interest in Peleshian has actually come more from the art world than, let's say, the cinephile world. His films have begun to screen in galleries, um, and he's actually managed to get a certain amount of funding from the art world, which is definitely good for kind of spreading the word about Peleshian. But I also think there's a limitation to the spectator watching the work of Peleshian or someone like Peleshian in a gallery, where I think it really demands a kind of cinematic experience. So hopefully they can continue playing in cinemas or cinema-like environments at the very least. But the dangers of the interest in Peleshian from the art world are probably outweighed by the fact that it was from this corner of the culture industry that he actually finally had or received the funding to make what was a very improbable comeback. I mean, I had basically accepted that he was never going to make another film again. His previous film, his latest film had been Live from 1993, nearly 30 years now. Since then, he's now well into his 80s. But La Nature actually was released in 2021. His longest film to date, 60 minutes, funded by the Fondation Cartier pour l'Art Contemporain in France. And indeed, its initial screening was in the Fondation Cartier Gallery in Paris. So it screened in a gallery setting before it ever made it to cinemas. It's since had cinema screenings. I think Center for Armenian Studies wanted it. Couldn't make that work, unfortunately, but hopefully it will come to Michigan at some point. It was a long time in production, so it was completed and kind of sent out into the world 15 years after the initial commission was kind of made. So he's not, a fast-paced, filmmaker in terms of his production rhythms. This film in particular continues the ecological themes of the inhabitants and the seasons with footage of natural disasters, tsunamis, tornadoes, volcanic eruptions, sweeping away the edifice of human civilization. We see this kind of destruction that these natural catastrophes could cause. Most of the footage was actually, interestingly enough, culled from YouTube and various other online sources. So as a way in which, I think almost Peleshian, his work was in a way foreshadowing what has later become this kind of very widespread practice of YouTube compilations or re-edits and so on and so forth of found footage. But he transfers all that footage into black and white, which kind of gives the film a very distinct patina and sets it to this kind of musical score that incorporates both classical and contemporary Armenian composers. There is an undeniable lyricism, though, of the imagery, despite the destructive nature of the footage we're seeing. And in this sense, I think La Nature, it's a film I've only been able to watch recently, so I don't yet have a lot of kind of formulated thoughts about it. But it very much continues what we could call the pre-Babelic approach to film language. Artavazd Peleshian kind of has this quote that film is the language that we have before the Tower of Babel is destroyed, and it kind of has this kind of primordial quality to it. And La Nature, despite kind of being this kind of digital work, showing this imagery that comes from kind of online sources, has this very timeless quality to it as well that I find very fascinating. So that's basically it from me. Thank you for listening. I'm open now to any questions that we might have from the audience in the auditorium or coming via Zoom.
Thank you, Daniel, for this awesome talk. This was great. I have lots of questions. But we'll start with a question from the Zoom audience. Let's do that. And the question is from Hagop Asatriyan. And he's wondering, in your opinion, why has the art of Peleshian mainly remained within the knowledge sphere of cinephiles and film experts and not become mainstream? And then He's also wondering what steps can be taken to popularize and further publicize his films.
Okay, that's a very good question. I mean, it's the kind of work that I wish had a kind of mainstream popularity to it that I think in an alternative society would have that ability. You know, I think it's work like this that I think shows the tragedy of our current cultural order. Let's say that we're not, you know, that the broad masses of the population are not able to be exposed, let's say, to work such as this, with a kind of like treated to the garbage pile of contemporary culture. Not to be too down, you know, down on that kind of stuff. And what can we do to change that? All we have to do is revolutionize the entire world. There's that. But short of that, I think, I mean, what's, I guess, frustrating about these films is that there is actually no, you know, short of hosting an event like this, there's no like legitimate way to watch them. They've never been put out onto DVD. Certainly not any reputable DVD. There's this kind of, you know, they have primarily circulated through pirate channels. It's good we have those channels. I'm certainly a user of those channels. That's how I first managed to watch Peleshian's films. I later, as I mentioned, had the fortune to watch them kind of in cinematic screenings, but they're not out on, they've never been released on DVD. I think that's something that, I mean, it's a crying shame that that's not the case. That said, to put it diplomatically, Peleshian has never seemed to be interested in taking the initiative on that level. He's an interesting character. Anyone who's had dealings with him will probably know that. And I have the feeling that his probably ideal kind of fate for his films is for them to be locked in like a nuclear silo or something, and like millions of years after humanity's become extinct, these films will still exist there, and that's what will be left of our civilization. That would be his like ideal vision for how the film should be what future there should be for those films. I think, I mean, if that's all that was left of humanity, it wouldn't be such a bad. I mean, there could be worse things if that's what was left. So yeah, there's just, I mean, the ability to make these films available outside of just like YouTube or like people file sharing. And then I think, you know, it'd be great if there was more critical writing on these films. I've done my share, but I mean, as I mentioned, there hasn't yet been a book-length study. I think the films are so like, there's so much material in them, even if the actual material is quite, you know, the corpus is quite small, but there's so much packed into them that I think, you know, PhD students, you know, should be like attracted to this material. That's what they should be thinking about. Yeah, that would be my suggestions, short of like world revolution.
Or you writing that book yourself, perhaps.
Maybe yeah, maybe.
Then we have another question from Michael Pfeiffer, our colleague here at Michigan. And he says, thanks for a fantastic talk. And he's asking you to talk a little bit about Peleshian's reception in Armenia, or his relation to other Armenian filmmakers. And this brings me to a question in terms of Peleshian's relation to also the Soviet government. We saw, of course, that we was, no, not we, the beginnings, right?
No, we was the one that was kind of
was commissioned. We was the genocide one. And,
yeah.
And the beginnings was commissioned by by who? By the Soviet government?
I mean, well, all these films prior to going up to My Century were, I mean, Soviet-funded films, right?
It would be interesting to hear what is his relationship to the Soviet government, but then also, of course, Michael's question about his relationship to Armenian filmmakers and Armenian.
Yeah. So I mean, the Soviet film industry in particular had this strange way of functioning, which was that filmmakers. I mean, the education of filmmakers was absolutely unparalleled. The training they got, the access to films they got as well, that the wider population didn't get, and then the support they got on a financial and on a kind of the level of resources was also unparalleled, and the like lack of pressure to you have to make like commercial films or whatever. And this is what enabled filmmakers like Parajanov and Tarkovsky and Peleshian and, you know, so many others to emerge. and they were given money to make films, and then the films would dissatisfy this final authority of the censorship bodies, which would then say, oh, you have to change it, or we're just not gonna. I mean, films usually weren't like banned per se; they were just like shelved. They were just like put on the back burner, like, oh, we'll release it later or something. Parajanov was probably the big exception there, where he really was in prison. But then also, like, even after that happened, they could go back and apply for funding for a film and get it again. And so there was this weird system where the support was there for filmmakers to make their films and to actually finish them and get them done and get them completed. And then right at the end, that's when the penny dropped, and that's when they met trouble. So in some ways, I mean, right up until that final moment, there's this incredible freedom for filmmakers that, let's say, American filmmakers wouldn't enjoy, because the commercial pressures already hit in so much early in that process. But it meant that the censorship at the end was so much more like kind of difficult to handle. But the fact that Peleshian, I mean, he's this marginalized figure, but he could still make a film like Our Century, which had a lot of money put into it. I mean, a lot of that was footage he like shot. I mean, a lot of it was archival, from space and so on and so on. But he shot a lot of film. They were very accommodating to him. And then at the end, they were like, oh, we don't like this, we don't like that, whatever. But until then, they didn't touch a thing. I mean, he edited the film in complete freedom. I mean, this is this kind of strange schizophrenia in the Soviet, like in the relationship of Soviet authorities to filmmakers. And I think other filmmakers have very similar tales to tell. What was the other question that he had? If you can just remind me quickly. It was about the other Armenian film.
Yeah. His reception in Armenia and also his relation to other Armenian filmmakers is what Michael was wondering.
Yeah, I don't know that much about his reception in Armenia. I do know that if you now go onto the Gyumri tourism website, there's a page dedicated to Peleshian, Gyumri's most famous son, basically. Like, look at this, is a world famous filmmaker who came from our town. But with his relationship with other filmmakers was quite interesting. In particular, Mikhail Vartonov, who was a pretty big figure in the Armenian film world, but then got into a lot of trouble when he made a documentary that defended Parajanov, and it was kind of like espousing Parajanov as like this great filmmaker, great poet, and at the precise moment that Parajanov was falling out of favor. And Peleshian actually wrote the script for a film that Vartonov attempted to make, Autumn Pastoral. And then Vartonov actually, because he couldn't get employment anywhere else, actually worked as the cinematographer on The Seasons. So there was a very deep collaboration between those two filmmakers. Peleshian himself also wrote, my battery is almost empty. Maybe Naira, would you be able to get my plug from my bag just so we don't lose connection? So yeah, he also worked on segments of the Konchalovsky, a Russian filmmaker, not an Armenian filmmaker, the Konchalovsky film Siberiad, which is actually quite a big kind of Soviet kind of blockbuster from 1979. And so there are kind of segments of that film that have kind of Peleshian's imprint. Yeah.
Interesting, because it brings me to a question that I had about the images and the footage, because there's a very clear distinction between sort of the earlier films that are working with these archival footages, and then Seasons is filmed, and
it's mainly his own, pretty much all of it, unless there's some exceptions.
Is there a discussion around the techniques? I mean, a lot of the imagery, when one views it, it seems like would be very difficult to shoot.
Hang on, I'll just sort this out and then come back. What's interesting, I think, was that he also attempted as much as possible to make, I mean, there are some exceptions, but generally tried to make the distinction between archival footage and footage he shot himself as indetectable by the spectator as possible. And I think it was actually quite interesting the way he kind of would like reduplicate the footage again and again and again, so that those distinctions were kind of minimized. I think this scene I showed from Weir is probably the big exception there, where it is very clear that like he's making a real like clear demarcation between the kind of historical footage and the contemporary footage. I would like to hear from the audience what their thoughts are on that historical footage where that comes from, because I'm very dubious about its actual provenance.
Yeah, I'm super curious about where does this footage come from, because it's not any kind of imagery that I have seen.
Yeah, and I imagine there are people, I mean, more experts on the genocide that would know whether there was any film footage. But my understanding is there was no footage taken of that moment, but maybe people can enlighten us.
So I have a question from Ron. He says, thank you for your terrific lecture. And he says, I was intrigued by the shift from Soviet political history to global ecological work. But as I watched La Nature, I was looking for its politics and was perplexed, trying to find it. Nature overwhelms human, but then some of the disasters are human-made. And the lyrical ending seemed to promise a kind of redemption. Can you help me with this confusion?
I mean, I have to say I share a little bit of the confusion. Well, not confusion, I would say, but like, I think it's probably a film that needs to settle a bit in my mind before I can say anything a bit a bit deeper about it. I mean, there's this kind of moment of, yes, like kind of the splendor of nature at the start, which we return to at the end, and then in between this very long middle segment where it's just a kind of disaster after disaster. There's a huge, I mean, probably something like 25 minutes of footage of the Japanese tsunami, where, I mean, there's a very, I mean, it's very clear what he's saying, that like nature overwhelms, you know, the anything that humanity can possibly produce or build or kind of contribute, and maybe we should all be a bit more humble about that. But what's the deeper political meaning of the film? I would have to kind of maybe stew on that question a little bit longer. Just maybe one interesting thing though is that there are certain shots from La Nature that actually are very similar to shots from We see these kind of explosions of cliff faces and so on and so forth, which already visible in We, so a film from 1969, and virtually the same shots can be seen in La Nature. I don't think literally the same shots, but they very kind of iconographically similar. So again, there's a way in which I think contrapuntal montage or this kind of distance montage works not only within his films, but also between his films, the way that certain shots resonate from one film to the next. And I think that's another interesting way in which the films work as a kind of corpus, not just as these kind of individual films that kind of are seen in isolation from one another.
When you were talking about the sort of montage at a distance and giving these examples between these various films, in Season it seemed like there was also the montage again was linked to sound and movement. You sort of mentioned this sort of vertical movements down the hill with the haystacks and the sheep. But then there was also this incredible cacophony of sound that was attached to horizontal movement. I felt like going through the tunnel and the sounds of horses going, which was quite brutal, going across the river with the sheep, and nature really impending on this movement of the flock across. It was sort of an interesting way to think about these different types of movement, but then also attached to the sound. One was sort of this music of Vivaldi, but then the sort of horizontal movement was attached to this really sort of screaming sound.
Yeah, but there's also, I mean, there's the movement, and then there's the kind of obstacles to movement as well. The fact that they're trying to, I mean, the farmers, you see them trying to cross this like rapids, and they're just like basically being like propelled through the water, holding the deer alive onto their sheep. So there's this kind of like the obstacles that are in their way. There's these amazing shots of them like hoeing the grass, all in this like perfect, like coordinated movement. Whether Peleshian staged that or it just happened across the scene, I'm not sure. But there is a perfect choreography to it that also works very well with the music. I think that, I mean, I think in general use of music is very interesting and it's very fundamental to the films, and is in a way if you wanted to think, well, what would Eisenstein or Vertov have been doing if they had that kind of same? I mean, they did make films in the sound area, but were more restricted in what they could do at that time. I think Peleshian is close to that kind of dream you might have of what those guys would have been doing, if they had that same kind of freedom in the sound era. And indeed, actually, there are shots from the seasons that almost directly, like not taken in an archival sense, but in the kind of have a distinct parallel with certain shots from A Sixth of the World by Vertov. In that film, you also see farmers carrying sheep through the water. You also see, not in that film, in Enthusiasm by Vertov, you also see these people kind of hoeing like the grass and so on and so forth. And if that's could just be an unconscious citation or kind of homage by Peleshian, but it certainly shows the distinct parallels there are between his own work and those let's say earlier figures. Kind of great male directors who are in many cases doing a lot of the work behind the scenes. It's very similar with Bellatar and his wife, and I mean there are countless examples of that. I think there's another filmmaking couple, Straub Huillet, where like for a long time Danielle Huillet's contribution was totally ignored, and it was just Straub. But she was always kind of an equal, and I think belatedly her contribution has been recognized. But I think that seems very credible to me that she was the one. I mean, probably they were both in the editing suite. She was the one holding the film, but I'm sure they were engaged in a kind of collaborative process in that sense. But he's the one who gets the credit. I mean, this is a sad reality for many corners of the film industry.
Okay.
She seems to always accompany him as well too, because I've been at a couple of events with Peleshian, and his wife is always there as well. Rarely says anything, but is kind of on hand.
Seems like both of them are people of silence, I guess.
Yes.
I have a question about the ethnography. It seems like ethnography plays big into the films, or at least the one that we saw today. It seems a sort of traditional way of anthropological ethnography that plays into it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think that is probably most present in the seasons more than anything else. I mean, I think what's interesting is you get this kind of in that film almost these kind of multiple historical layers all present at once. So you have the kind of contemporary world, and I mean, you see the wedding, which is this kind of combination of contemporary, young people and so on and so forth, with kind of like young people's haircuts and stuff, and like the sideburns and everything. But also the kind of more traditional wedding customs. You have these farming practices that have probably been largely unchanged for millennia, and then you have like the landscape, which is like millions of years old, and you have those like all of those layers of history, geological history, prehistory, and then kind of contemporary history, kind of coalescing with one another. So I think there is this kind of ethnographic quality to his films. His interest for the kind of the human environment, or these kind of human, very, like the diversity of, let's say, different cultures, including in his own backyard, essentially. I mean, there's kind of Armenia is a small country. This wouldn't have been very far away from where he grew up or where he lived. That I think The Seasons is the film where that comes out the most. You get this something of a sense of the same kind of thing happening in We. I think in We there's also footage of a kind of public funeral, and then I think footage also of this kind of these 1965 demonstrations, and then of course the repatriation kind of ceremonies or kind of moments at the airport. We have that same kind of, I mean, just this kind of, like the wedding sequence in The Seasons, just this kind of outpouring of public emotion, this kind of a mass gathering that is a kind of very, you know, has a very, I think, emotional resonance for, I mean, the people involved, but also for the viewer that it kind of is transmitted to us very directly.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
But yeah, I think that the question of Peleshian and ethnography is a big one that definitely is worth kind of mining more deeply.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to you doing that and writing this book on this man.
Well, I'll put it on the list of books to write.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. It's been such a pleasure learning more about Peleshian, learning about your own work, and yeah, thank you so very much for being here and coming all the way from Frankfurt to be with us here in Ann Arbor.
Thank you. I'm glad it was touch and go for a minute, but I'm glad we did this in the end in person.
Absolutely. Thank you.